never thought I'd have a reason to tell this story, but the more I think about it, the creepier it gets. I'm the kind of person who notices everything. Probably a little too much, but that's just how I am. I've always been obsessed with keeping things in order. Everything in my house has a place, and it needs to stay exactly where I left it. My place is always spotless, super clean, neat, and organized, to the point where my friends joke about me being uptight. But honestly, it's just how I keep my sanity. So, here's what happened. It was a normal night. I'd been out with friends, got home late, around midnight. The house was quiet, like usual. I locked the door, turned on the lights, and started getting ready for bed. Before that, I went over to my dresser and checked myself in the mirror. I was exhausted, my hair a mess from the night out, and I just wanted to sleep. But then, as I glanced down at my dresser, I noticed something off. A perfume bottle was missing its lid. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous to some, but it's the kind of thing I never forget. I never, ever leave anything out of place, and certainly not a perfume bottle without its lid. I sat there for a moment, staring at it, feeling a strange sense of unease. But I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was just in a rush earlier. The door was locked and everything else seemed fine, so I let it go, thinking I was just tired. I went about my night routine, trying to shake off the weird feeling. I washed up, changed into my pajamas, and sat at my dresser to brush my hair before bed. It's part of my routine, always the same, every night. It was quiet. The house was dead silent, just the hum of the fridge in the background, and I was starting to feel relaxed when I noticed something in the mirror. At first, I didn't really notice, just a flicker of movement in the background, but I thought it was just a shadow. Then I looked again, and that's when I saw it. A man. Under my bed. He was huge, lying under the bed, wearing a leather jacket, just staring at me, watching me. My heart dropped, and I felt a cold wave of terror hit me. It was like my body couldn't process what I was seeing. I felt frozen, like I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My whole body went numb as the reality hit. He must have been there the whole time. The perfume bottle missing its lid? That was him, moving around while I was out. I was completely paralyzed by fear, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. My hands were trembling, but I forced myself to keep brushing my hair, pretending everything was fine. My heart was pounding so loud it was all I could hear. I kept staring at his reflection in the mirror, too terrified to turn around and look at him directly, afraid that if he realized I'd seen him, something terrible would happen. Somehow, I managed to stay calm, even though my heart was racing. I kept brushing my hair for a few more seconds, pretending like everything was normal, even though my hands were shaking. Then, I slowly put the brush down and pretended to adjust something on my dresser, anything to keep up the act that I hadn't seen him. My phone was on the nightstand, way too close to the bed. There was no way I was going to risk reaching for it. So, I kept my breathing steady and pretended everything was normal. I walked over to the bedroom door, still acting calm, and as soon as I stepped out, I closed the door behind me as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking as I locked it, trapping him inside. The room didn't have any windows facing the street, so I knew he couldn't escape easily. The second the lock clicked, I sprinted down the hallway, heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my keys, bolted for the front door, and ran to my car. Once I was inside, I locked the doors and finally let myself break down. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911, but I managed to call the cops. I sat there in the dark, staring at the house, terrified that any second I'd see him trying to get out. Luckily, the police arrived quickly. I stayed in my car, heart racing as they stormed the house. They found him still in the room, hiding under the bed, just like I'd left him, probably waiting for me to come back. No forced entry, no broken windows. It turns out he had picked the lock and slipped in without a trace. The fact that he'd been in my house that long without me knowing, that still haunts me. When they pulled him out, I finally got a good look at him. He was huge, much bigger than I'd realized from his reflection. The sight of him standing there, calm and silent, made my stomach drop. There was no way I could have defended myself if he had decided to attack. After everything, I still can't fully wrap my head around how close I came to something awful that night. The police told me I did everything right, that locking him in was the best move I could have made. But the thought that he had been in my house, moving around while I was out with my friends, still sends chills down my spine. I think about that moment, brushing my hair while my hands shook, pretending nothing was wrong, trying to stay calm when every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. I don't know how I kept it together long enough to make it out of there safely. The thought of what could have happened if I hadn't seen him that night still keeps me up sometimes. Not knowing what his true intentions were, that's what haunts me the most. It's terrifying to realize just how vulnerable we are in the one place where we should feel safest, our own homes. I was driving back from a friend's party late Saturday night with my wife, who prefers not to have her name mentioned, so I'll just call her Emily. It was one of those parties where you lose track of time, and before you know it, it's way past midnight. We live about 5 hours away, and instead of staying at our friend's place, we decided to drive home. We were driving on the highway when we suddenly hit a big traffic jam. It was strange because it was almost 2 a.m. We didn't know what caused it, maybe construction or an accident. We waited for a while, but it was clear we wouldn't be moving soon. Emily checked Google Maps and found a detour that looked good. It was an old road next to the highway that would get us back on track a few miles ahead. We took the exit and drove down the narrow, winding road. At first, it felt good to be moving again, even though the road was rough. But as we went further, the feeling changed. The trees seemed to close in on us, and the air felt thick and heavy. There was no moon, no light, just our headlights cutting through the darkness. We'd been driving on that narrow road for about 30 minutes when I felt the urge to pee. I tried to ignore it at first, not wanting to get out of the car in the darkness on such a deserted road. But soon, it became unbearable. I looked over at Emily, who was asleep in the passenger seat, and decided it was best to pull over and take care of it. The road was only one lane, so I carefully parked on the narrow shoulder. Even though the road was empty at this hour, I didn't want to block the way for any other cars that might come through. I stepped out into the cold night, leaving Emily sleeping inside. I walked a few feet away from the car into the shadows of the trees and unzipped my pants. As I was finishing up, I heard the car door open behind me. Thinking it was Emily getting out for some reason, I didn't pay much attention. But then suddenly, Emily screamed. My heart jumped into my throat as I quickly zipped up and ran back to the car. To my horror, a large, dirty old man was sitting in the driver's seat. He was frantically searching under the wheel, looking for the key to start the car, but thankfully, I had taken it with me when I got out. As I ran back, I first saw Emily standing beside the car, terrified, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She must have jumped out as soon as she realized what was happening. The sight of him there, so out of place and threatening, made my heart pound with fear. Acting on pure adrenaline, I rushed to the car and grabbed the man by his collar. He was heavy, but at that moment, I felt incredibly powerful. I pulled him out with all my strength. He stumbled and fell to the ground. Without wasting a second, I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and started the car. Emily was already in tears, her face pale with fear. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas pedal, the tires spinning before we sped away from the terrifying scene. In the rearview mirror, I saw the old man scrambling to his feet, his figure quickly swallowed by the darkness as we put distance between us. The rest of the drive was a blur of tension and fear, both of us too shaken to speak. I cursed myself for leaving the car unlocked. I had been so naive, thinking that something like this would never happen to us. I had clearly underestimated the situation. I thought I wouldn't be gone long, and that nothing would happen with me so close by. Emily was terrified. She told me that the old man had woken her up when he got into the car, and she had been paralyzed with fear until she screamed. The rest of the drive was a blur of tension and silence, both of us too shaken to speak. The dark road ahead seemed endless, and every shadow felt like a potential threat. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white, trying to focus on getting us home safely. As we kept driving, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. My mind was full of what-ifs. What if I hadn't taken the keys with me? What if the man had been armed or more aggressive? The most terrifying thought hit me. What if the old man had found the keys and driven off with Emily still in the car? My heart raced at the idea, and I gripped the steering wheel even tighter. Finally, we got home safely. The familiar sight of our house brought a wave of relief, but the night's events still lingered in my mind. We parked the car and sat there for a moment, both of us trying to calm down. It was a harsh lesson, but we were grateful to be safe. I felt terrible for not taking safety seriously when I left the car doors unlocked. I had thought we were safe because we were so close and it was such a short stop. But I had learned the hard way how quickly things could go wrong. The fear and guilt weighed heavily on me, and I knew I wouldn't make the same mistake again. I didn't fully understand what happened that night until I saw the CCTV footage. Watching myself in that grainy, distant footage made everything feel more real and a lot more terrifying. But in the moment, everything happened so fast, and I had no idea how close I was to something terrible. I'll tell you the story from my perspective, and then I'll explain what I saw later. It was a normal evening. I had just gotten back from the grocery store, tired after a long day, just looking forward to getting home, putting the groceries away, and relaxing. My apartment's on the 4th floor, so as usual, I took the elevator. When the elevator doors opened, there was already a guy inside. He seemed pretty normal, maybe a little scruffy, but nothing that would make you look twice. I stepped in, arms full of groceries, and hit the button for my floor. We didn't talk, just had that awkward silence you get when you're in an elevator with a stranger. But I could feel his presence, out of the corner of my eye, and for some reason, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't explain why at the time, but something felt off. I figured he must be waiting for another floor or something, but as I walked down the hallway toward my apartment door, I could still feel his eyes on me. It was weird. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the elevator doors closing, but no. He was still there, standing in the elevator, holding the doors open, just staring at me. Motionless. My heart started racing, but I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. I mean, it's a big building. Maybe he lived on another floor. I was just overthinking it. When I reached my door, my hands were shaking as I tried to get my keys out. I could feel his eyes on me the whole time, and I swear, the hallway was dead silent except for my own breathing. I struggled to get the door unlocked, my heart beating faster than I'd ever felt. The moment I turned the handle, it happened. Footsteps, heavy, fast, coming right at me. I didn't even have time to turn around before he was on me. He lunged, shoving me hard, trying to push his way into my apartment. Everything happened so fast, I didn't even think. I just reacted on pure instinct. The moment I felt him push, I shoved back with all my strength, slamming the door in his face. My heart was pounding so hard, I could barely hear anything but the sound of him hitting the door, trying to force his way in. My legs were shaking, and I was gripping the doorknob so tightly, I thought it might snap off. I screamed for help, hoping a neighbor would hear me. Then he hit the door again, harder this time. I could feel his entire weight pushing against it, trying to overpower me. I was pressed against the door, my feet slipping on the floor as I struggled to keep it shut. Somehow, I managed to reach over and turn the lock with my other hand, finally locking the door just as he shoved one last time. For a terrifying second, I thought it wouldn't hold. But the moment I locked it, I could feel the pressure ease up a little. He kept pushing for another few seconds, then nothing. For a moment, everything went silent. I didn't hear anything, and I didn't dare move. Then suddenly, I heard him, his footsteps pounding down the stairwell, echoing off the walls as he fled. I just stood there, frozen, my hands gripping the doorknob, too scared to move. I don't know how long I stood like that. It felt like forever. When I finally gathered myself enough to move, I checked the peephole. The hallway was empty. Just the quiet hum of the elevator in the distance and the sound of my own rapid breathing. The next morning, I was still freaked out from what had happened. The guy had tried to force his way into my apartment, and I barely managed to get the door shut in time. I knew I needed to report it to the police, but first, I wanted to see if the building's security cameras had caught anything. I went to the landlord and asked if I could check the CCTV footage from the night before. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe just some proof that I wasn't overreacting, that the whole thing wasn't in my head. But when I saw the footage, my stomach dropped. There I was, walking down the hallway, totally unaware. And there he was, standing in the elevator, holding the doors open, staring right at me the whole time. As soon as I turned my back and started walking to my apartment, he stepped out. The footage showed him following me down the hall, keeping just far enough behind so I wouldn't notice. Then, right as I reached my door and started fumbling with my keys, he broke into a run. You can literally see the moment he lunged at me, trying to push his way in. It wasn't just in my head. He had been watching, waiting for the right moment. If I hadn't closed the door in time, I don't even want to think about what could have happened. The police never found the guy. They checked the CCTV footage, talked to some neighbors, but it was like he disappeared into thin air. That freaked me out more than anything, that someone could try something like that and just disappear without a trace. I haven't used the elevator since. I just can't. The thought of being in that tiny space with a stranger makes my skin crawl. Even now, if I have to take an elevator somewhere, I make sure I'm alone. If someone else steps in, I'll either wait for the next one or take the stairs. It's just not worth the risk. I've become way more careful. I started paying attention to my surroundings, always checking behind me, always locking my door the moment I get home. It's strange how one moment can change the way you see everything, how it can make something as simple as an elevator ride feel dangerous. I never really thought about how little we actually know the people we meet online until it happened to me. It all started like any other Tinder match. His name was Jeff, and we'd been seeing each other for a few months by then. Casual dinners, movie nights, nothing serious but enough for me to feel like I knew him well enough. Then he told me his apartment was being renovated and asked if he could crash at my place for a few days. Honestly, it didn't seem like a big deal at the time. We were already spending most nights together anyway, so I figured, what's the harm in a few days? So I let him stay over. The first night was totally normal. We made dinner, watched Netflix, and just hung out like we usually did. Everything seemed fine. But the next morning, things started to feel off. I went to open the curtains to let in some sunlight, and he jumped up, rushing over to stop me. "Let's keep them closed. I just like it darker," he said with this weird edge to his voice. It caught me off guard, but I shrugged it off. People have their preferences, right? But then, he started doing little things, silencing his phone every time it rang, avoiding any mention of his place or friends, and asking me repeatedly not to tell anyone he was staying with me. That was the red flag I should have paid more attention to. I asked him about it once, casually, like, "Hey, why don't you want anyone to know you're here?" He gave me this half-hearted laugh and brushed it off, saying, "I just like to keep things private, you know? I don't want people in my business." It was weird, but I didn't press. I guess I didn't want to come off as paranoid or controlling. At night, we ended up staying up pretty late, probably around 1 a.m. We were just chilling, me watching some random movie, and him sitting next to me on the couch, scrolling through his phone. It was getting late, and I figured it was time to head to bed. Before I went, I did what I usually do, just a casual glance out the window, and that's when I saw a guy across the street, leaning on his car, just watching the house. He was dressed all in black, smoking a cigarette, and not moving, just staring. It gave me this immediate, unsettling feeling. At first, I thought maybe I was overreacting. It was late, and maybe this guy was just waiting for someone or lost. But something about the way he was just standing there, not moving, staring at the house, made my skin crawl. I turned to Jeff and, trying to keep it casual, said, "Hey, there's some guy outside, just standing there, staring at the house. Do you know him?" His reaction was immediate, and not at all what I expected. He froze for a second, then jumped up from the couch and came over to the window. He only looked out for a quick second before pulling the curtain shut. "Don't look out there again," he whispered, his voice tense. "And don't turn on any lights." My stomach dropped. "What? Why? Who is that?" He didn't answer. He just pulled me away from the window, his face looking more serious than I'd ever seen it. "It's nothing," he said, but his tone didn't match his words. "Just trust me. Don't let him see you." At that point, alarm bells were going off in my head. I could feel the tension radiating off him, and I knew something was seriously wrong. I pressed him again. "What's going on? Why is that guy watching the house?" But he just shook his head. "It's nothing you need to worry about. Just stay away from the windows." I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, and I could feel that creeping sense of dread settling in. This wasn't normal. I barely slept that night, every little noise making me jump, and the thought of that man outside stayed in my mind. The next day, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I asked him who that guy was, why he was outside my house in the middle of the night. That's when the truth finally came out. He wasn't just some guy dealing with apartment renovations. He was hiding from dangerous people. He told me he'd gotten himself involved with the wrong guys, and now they were after him. And because he was staying with me, they knew where I lived. That's when things got even worse. Jeff looked at me, his face pale, and said, "I need money. They're after me for a lot, and I don't have it. Can you help me?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I could barely afford my own rent, bills, and groceries, and here he was asking for some insane amount of money that was way beyond anything I had. Even if I gave him every penny I had, it would have amounted to nothing compared to what he needed. I tried to explain that I didn't have that kind of money, that I was barely surviving as it was, but the desperation in his eyes told me he was running from something far darker than I could have ever imagined. I was caught in the middle of it, and the danger had already reached my doorstep. That night was worse. It was past midnight, and I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house seemed amplified, and I kept thinking about the man I'd seen outside the night before. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling when I heard it, a car pulling up outside. My heart immediately started pounding. I got up quietly and walked to the window, carefully pulling the curtain back just a fraction. 3 men had gotten out of a black van and were walking toward my house. My hands started shaking as I watched them approach. They looked rough, like they'd been through some serious stuff. One of them had a baseball cap pulled low, another had tattoos up his arms, and the third was bigger than the rest, wearing a leather jacket. They walked with purpose, not like they were lost or confused, but like they knew exactly what they were here for. I rushed to the living room where Jeff was sleeping on the couch, looking as pale as I'd ever seen him. "They're here," I whispered, my voice shaky. He jumped up, panicking, pacing back and forth. Shit. What do I do? "You need to hide me. Please, just let me stay here. They don't have to see me," he begged, his eyes wide with fear. I shook my head. "No, you need to leave. I'm not getting involved in this." My voice was firm, but inside I was terrified. The doorbell rang and we both froze. He turned to me, pleading, "Please, just don't answer it. We can pretend no one's home." But I shook my head again. "No, you need to deal with this. I'm not hiding you." Realizing I wasn't going to help, he walked to the door, his hands shaking. I quickly backed into the kitchen, hiding just out of sight. My heart was racing as I peeked through the gap in the doorway. He opened the door, and the three men stood there, glaring at him. The guy with the tattoos stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "You've been real hard to find, Jeffy. You got something for us?" Jeff stammered, I need more time. I'm working on it." The man in the leather jacket let out a dry laugh. "Time's up. We want the money. Now." Jeff was shaking, practically cowering in front of them. "I don't have it yet. I'll get it to you. I swear." The guy with the baseball cap stepped forward, his voice cold. "That's not gonna work. You're coming with us." Jeff hesitated, looking back at the house for a second, maybe thinking I could still help him. But I stayed hidden, watching from the kitchen. There was no way I was getting involved in whatever mess he'd created. The man with the tattoos grabbed Jeff by the arm, pulling him toward the car. "Let's go," he said, not leaving room for argument. "We've got some business to take care of, and you're part of it." Jeff didn't fight them. He knew he didn't have a choice. I stayed still, barely breathing as they led him to the car. They didn't even look around, as if they knew no one else would be stupid enough to interfere. As they drove off, I stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the empty street. That was the last time I saw him. I thought about calling him later, just to find out what happened, but I was too scared. What if they traced the call or somehow found out I was involved? I didn't want to risk it. Whatever mess he was in, I didn't want to be dragged any deeper into it. So, I stayed silent. I never told anyone about what happened that night. I didn't even call the cops. I figured the less I knew, the safer I'd be. After they left, I locked every door, double-checked the windows, and prayed they wouldn't come back. Every time a car pulled up outside, my heart would pound, thinking it was them. Or worse, thinking Jeff might come back, dragging me further into whatever mess he was in. Luckily, I was living on rent at the time, and after that weekend I knew I couldn't stay there. It was easy enough to pack up and find a new place, somewhere they wouldn't know to look. I didn't leave a forwarding address, didn't tell anyone where I was going, just in case Jeff, or those men, came looking for me. I wanted to disappear from their radar completely. Sometimes I feel guilty about the whole thing, about handing Jeff over to them like that. I know I didn't have a choice, but the thought still lingers. I wonder what happened to him after they took him, if he ever got out of the mess he was in. But deep down, I know how those stories usually end, and it's never good. Still, I tell myself that I did what I had to do to protect myself. If I'd helped him or tried to hide him, I would have been dragged deeper into a situation I didn't understand, with people I didn't want to cross. And while moving helped ease some of the anxiety, I still find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if I'll ever really feel free from what happened that night. I'm a grown man now, but I still remember the first time I stayed at an Airbnb like it was yesterday. This happened a few years ago, but it stuck with me ever since. Back then, I was just a student living with my parents and younger brother in a rural area. All I wanted was to move to the city. That was like a big dream to me at that time. It might sound silly to some, but when you're surrounded by nothing but mountains and trees your whole life, you start to wonder what else is out there. So, when it came time to continue my studies after high school, I saw it as my chance to finally get out and explore the city. We didn't have any universities where I lived, so I had to look in other towns. There was this one university I had my eye on, and I wanted to check it out before applying. The problem was, I didn't have a job and was living off my dad's paycheck, so money was tight. I couldn't afford a hotel, so I decided to try out Airbnb. I'd heard about it but never stayed in one before. It seemed like a good idea, and honestly, it was the only thing I could afford. The place was in a quiet neighborhood, kind of on the outskirts of town. I chose it because it was the cheapest option, even though it was a bit farther from the university. But then, I thought it would be fine for just one night. Turns out, that night was one I'd never forget. I got to the Airbnb a day before I was supposed to visit the university. It was late afternoon, and I was tired from the long bus ride. When I got there, the place looked way older and dirtier than I expected. Paint was peeling in large strips, and there were dark stains on the walls that I didn't want to think too much about. The whole place had an air of neglect, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The furniture was old, the kind you'd find in your grandparents' house, and everything felt worn down. Honestly, even our house back in the countryside looked better than this. But I wasn't expecting much. It was just one night, and I figured I could handle it. Besides, it was all I could afford, so I didn't have much choice. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, I was there for the university, not for luxury. I dropped my bag in the small bedroom, which had just enough space for a bed and a dresser, and decided to take a quick look around. The kitchen was small and basic, the kind of place where you'd maybe heat up a frozen meal, but not much else. The living room had a sagging couch and an old TV that looked like it hadn't been turned on in years. The worst part, though, was this weird feeling I got as I walked around. It's hard to explain, but I felt like I was being watched. There was no one else in the house, obviously, but every time I turned a corner, I had this strange feeling like I wasn't alone. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was just tired from the trip and letting my imagination get the best of me. I didn't bother unpacking or anything. I just wanted to rest. I took a quick shower, got into bed, and tried to fall asleep. But as soon as I lay down, I started hearing noises. At first, it was just a faint creaking sound. I tried to ignore it, but then it got louder. It sounded like something was moving around upstairs. The problem was, there wasn't supposed to be an upstairs, at least not from what I saw. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the more I listened, the more certain I was that someone was out there with me in the house. I turned to the other side and closed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. Definitely footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was trying not to be heard. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and tiptoed to the door. I opened it just a crack and peeked out into the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from a street lamp outside that barely filtered through the curtains. I listened for a moment, but the footsteps had stopped. As I walked down the hallway, I shined my flashlight around, trying to get a better look at everything. That's when something caught my eye, something I hadn't noticed before. Right above me, there was a square outline in the ceiling, a small square shape that seemed out of place. I stopped, squinting up at it, and realized it was a door, like the kind that leads to an attic. I didn't remember seeing it when I first walked through the house. The square door blended into the ceiling, its edges barely visible in the dim light. But now that I was standing right under it, it was impossible to miss. My first thought was that maybe the noise I'd heard came from up there. For some reason, I felt this weird urge to check it out. Maybe it's because I grew up in the countryside, where you see all kinds of strange things, or maybe I was just too tired to think straight. Either way, I wanted to see what was up there. The door was too high to reach, so I grabbed a chair from the living room and dragged it underneath the square. Even with the chair, I needed something to push the door open. I found a broom in the kitchen and used it to push up against the square. The door creaked as it slowly swung inward, revealing nothing but darkness above. It was heavier than I expected. I had to use both hands just to hold it up. I started wondering how anyone could even get up there. There wasn't a ladder or anything, and the door was so damn heavy. It didn't make any sense. And then, just as I was thinking that, it happened. As I held the attic door open, a sudden chill ran down my spine. I looked up, and my heart nearly stopped. A pair of eyes were staring down at me from the darkness. cold, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. I barely had time to process what I was seeing before the figure above slammed the attic door shut with so much force that it knocked me off balance. I fell off the chair and hit the floor hard, the broom clattering next to me. For a second, I just lay there, trying to catch my breath and process what the hell had just happened. My heart was racing, and all I could think was, what the fuck was that? I didn't stick around to find out. I grabbed my stuff and bolted out of that house as fast as I could. I didn't even bother closing the door behind me. I ran down the street until I was far enough away that I felt safe. I ended up spending the rest of the night at a 24-hour diner, just sitting there, trying to make sense of what happened. I couldn't leave town. I still had to apply to the university the next day. So I just waited there until morning, my nerves completely shot. When the sun finally came up, I went to the university, but I was so shaken up I could barely focus. I did what I had to do, applied, and got the hell out of town on the next bus. To this day, I have no idea who or what was in that attic. All I know is I'm never staying in an Airbnb again. My wife and I have been looking forward to this trip for years, a chance to escape to Veracruz, Mexico, and fully immerse ourselves in the culture we had always loved. We found this small Airbnb house in a pretty lively neighborhood, a mix of tourists and locals. The houses were all similar in layout, simple but charming, and designed to give visitors a taste of Mexican life. We loved that everything was so close. We'd walk to the local supermarket, grab fresh food, and say hi to the neighbors as they went about their day. I even got to practice my Spanish, though everyone spoke so fast that it was nothing like the slow, clear stuff you hear on TV. Still, it felt like we were really living that authentic Latin American experience we'd always dreamed about. During the day, the streets were busy, food vendors everywhere, music playing, families hanging out. It was exactly the vibe we wanted, super vibrant and alive. But when night fell, the vibe completely changed. The busy, lively energy just disappeared, and it got way too quiet in the neighborhood. We figured that's just how it goes here. Things calm down after a busy day. I mean, we've all heard the stereotypes about Latin America being dangerous, with cartels and drug dealers like in the movies. But honestly, we hadn't run into any problems. And sure, bad things can happen anywhere, but we weren't about to get careless. The Airbnb owner, Don Miguel, lived with his family right across from us. He told us if we ever needed anything, we could just come by and ask. But on the third night, we both woke up to this strange shuffling sound outside the door. It was faint, like someone dragging their feet slowly down the hallway. We didn't think much of it, figured it was just a neighbor coming home late or someone pacing around, normal neighborhood noises. The next morning, as we were leaving the house, we stepped on something right outside the door. At first, we didn't even notice it, but when we looked down, there it was. This weird white powder, just a small pile, almost like someone had spilled flour or something. We stood there for a second, confused. We ended up cleaning it up and moving on, not thinking too much of it. It's a shared building after all, so we figured maybe someone had dropped it on their way in and didn't bother cleaning it up. Then it happened again the next night. But this time, it wasn't powder. It was some kind of sticky liquid smeared right in front of our door. I actually stepped on it when we were heading out and I was pissed. We cleaned it up again, but this time we were getting really annoyed. By the next night, we'd had enough. We decided that the moment we heard the noise again, we'd open the door and catch whoever was messing with us. So when the shuffling started, I didn't hesitate. I swung the door open as fast as I could, and there she was, a woman just walking down the hallway like nothing happened. She was wearing this old, faded dress that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. Her sandals were barely holding together, scuffing the floor with every slow step. I called out to her like, "Senora!" But she didn't even turn around, didn't respond, just kept walking, slow and steady, like we weren't even there. The next morning, I told Don Miguel about the woman and what she did. He just nodded and said everyone in the neighborhood knows about her. Apparently, she lives alone, never talks to anyone, and nobody goes near her house. People avoid her because she does weird stuff around her place, but she's never really bothered anyone. He made it seem like it wasn't a big deal. Honestly, I started thinking she was just some superstitious freak or something. Later, I talked to my wife about it. We figured we weren't going to let this ruin our trip, especially with only one night left before we headed to another city. On our last night, things escalated. I had just come back from the local shop, picked up a few things for dinner, and as I turned the corner toward the house, I saw her. She was walking away from our door, slowly, like she had just finished something. My heart started racing. She clearly did something again. This time. As I got closer, I noticed a liquid smeared across the door, and the smell hit me before I even got close. I had no idea what it was, but the smell was so disgusting. I was so pissed off, I found myself running to her and yelling in Spanish, "Señora, what the hell is going on?" She didn't even react. She kept walking back toward her house like she always did. But this time, I wasn't letting her get away. I gently caught her arm, blocking her path. I didn't grab her hard, just enough to stop her. That's when she turned to look at me, slowly, and I finally got a good look at her face. She had deep wrinkles around her eyes and mouth, like she'd been frowning for years. Her eyes were sunken and looked way too big for her face, with this dull, lifeless stare that sent a chill through me. For a second, I froze. But before I could react, she lifted her hand, and without a single word, she slapped me so hard across the face. The force of it caught me off guard, way stronger than I expected from someone like her. My cheek was stinging, and I just stood there, completely stunned. She didn't look angry or upset at all, just calm and emotionless, like nothing even happened. Then, without saying a word, she turned around and calmly walked back to her house, disappearing into the shadows. I went back inside, still in shock. The next morning, we told Don Miguel what had happened. He apologized, but said the woman wasn't in her right mind. La Policía knows her, but they can't do anything about it, he explained. She's been here forever, always like this. They don't think she's dangerous, just strange. And honestly, people around here have learned to live with her. It was strange, honestly, that the whole neighborhood just seemed to live with her like that. It was like everyone had accepted her weird behavior as normal. But for us, it was way too much. That's when we decided to pack up and leave. We couldn't stay there any longer. My sister and I decided to throw a little party in my apartment one night. Nothing big, just the two of us hanging out in my apartment, blasting music, dancing around, and drinking more than we probably should have. We didn't care about the time or the noise. It was just the two of us, having a good time. The kind of night where you forget about everything and live in the moment. It wasn't like we were disturbing anyone. Or so we thought. We live in a big apartment building, so we didn't think the music would bother anyone. No one ever complained about anything, so we figured we were in the clear. We were having fun, dancing, laughing, the whole deal. The music was blasting, and honestly, we weren't even thinking about how loud it was. And that's when we heard it, a loud, aggressive knock at the door. We stopped and looked at each other, confused. This knock wasn't casual. It was aggressive, like someone was trying to break down the door. My sister rolled her eyes, and I figured it was just some neighbor being overly dramatic. So I went to open the door, not really thinking much of it. And there he was, this guy who lives a few doors down from me. Now, we'd never really talked to him, just passed him in the hall a few times. He was one of those neighbors you avoid without thinking, just gives off a weird vibe. Probably late 40s, but looked older. Always in this dirty old jacket with cold, empty eyes that seemed to size people up without really seeing them. When we opened the door, he didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at us with this cold, unsettling look. His eyes moved slowly, looking us up and down. We're both good-looking girls, and we knew it. We got attention sometimes, but this was different. The way he was staring wasn't flattering. It made my skin crawl, like we were being inspected for something far worse. We were in our usual home outfits, just shorts and tank tops, nothing fancy, but it was enough to catch the wrong kind of attention from a guy like him. Finally, he spoke. "Turn it off, now," he said, his face twisted with this creepy expression that only made the tension worse. No please, no explanation, just that cold, flat demand. My sister gave me a look, and I nodded. "Yeah, sure. Sorry," I said quickly, not wanting any drama. He stared at us for another few seconds, like he was trying to decide if we were serious. Then he turned and walked away without another word. As soon as the door clicked shut, we looked at each other, confused. My sister shook her head and let out a nervous laugh. "What the hell was that? Dude acts like he owns the place." We shrugged it off, thinking he was just being dramatic or maybe had a few drinks. He seemed off, but we didn't feel threatened, just annoyed. So we cranked the music back up, figuring that would be the end of it. It wasn't until much later that things took a terrifying turn. The music was still blasting, and we were so caught up in the moment that we almost forgot about the creepy neighbor from earlier. I don't remember the exact time. Everything was a blur. But suddenly, there was this violent bang. At first, we didn't know what it was, but then there was another, even harder bang that made the whole door frame shake. My sister and I exchanged a quick look, realizing something was wrong. I rushed to turn the music down, and just as I did, the door flew open. It was him. He had kicked it in. I couldn't believe it. Like, seriously. This guy actually kicked our door down. It felt so unreal, like something you only hear about but never expect to happen to you. There he was, standing in the doorway, his face cold and angry, staring us down. The look in his eyes wasn't just about the noise anymore. It was something way more intense, like he was waiting for an excuse to do this. My heart was pounding, and my sister froze next to me, both of us too shocked to react. He was back. Only this time, he wasn't just asking. Without a word, he walked right into the apartment like he owned the place. His face was stone cold, and he didn't say anything. He just walked over to the speakers, picked one up, and slammed it onto the floor with all his strength. The crash was deafening. My sister let out a small scream, but he didn't stop. He turned to the second speaker, lifted it above his head, and slammed it down just as hard, pieces flying everywhere. The music stopped instantly, and the apartment fell into this creepy, suffocating silence. He turned to us, his eyes dark and dead. "I told you to cut that shit." His voice was low and flat, filled with something much worse than anger. It was like he could do anything, and there wasn't a damn thing we could do to stop him. For a second, he just stood there, towering over us, and I swear, my heart felt like it was about to explode. I didn't know what to say. My sister didn't either. We were just standing there, staring at him, completely frozen. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving the door hanging wide open, the lock broken, and the shattered speakers lying at our feet. We stood there in the wreckage of our little party, stunned. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't stop staring at the door, half expecting him to come back. I felt sick. The way he just walked in like that, like it was no big deal, like we didn't even matter. It was terrifying. There was something in his eyes, something dark and dangerous, like he could have done a lot worse if he wanted to. We didn't talk much after that. We just sat there, staring at the broken door, still trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't stop thinking about how easily he came in, how helpless we were, just standing there while he destroyed our speakers. We considered calling the police, but in a way, it felt like it was our fault. After all, we were the ones blasting music late at night, so we didn't think they'd take us seriously. What could we even say? That we pissed off the neighbor and he took it too far? It felt like no matter what, we'd be the ones to blame. The next morning, we called the landlord to get the lock fixed. It's scary how fast your space can go from feeling totally safe to completely violated. Some people might hear this and say we deserved it, because we were loud, because we were having fun, that we somehow brought it on ourselves. But it wasn't like that. We didn't deserve to have someone barge into our home, destroy our stuff, and make us feel unsafe. I was 20 back then and still living with my parents, not exactly by choice, but I didn't have much of an option. I didn't work and they covered all my expenses. When my parents told me they'd be out of town for a whole week, I was honestly pretty excited. It was my first time alone at home, and a full week of freedom sounded perfect. No rules, no mom nagging me about my attitude or my carelessness. I thought it was going to be awesome. My mom is ridiculously strict though. Before she left, she gave me this epic list of chores, almost like she was mapping out my whole week in advance. She had every single day planned down to the smallest detail. No slacking off, she warned me with that classic mom look, half threatening and half disappointed. She was like, "I don't want to find anything out of place when I come back. I'll know if you haven't kept up." She was serious and annoying as hell. There wasn't much I could do about it anyway. She wasn't even out the door yet, and I was already rolling my eyes. At first, I was loving being alone. I had the entire house to myself, and I could eat all the junk food I wanted without anyone giving me looks. I stayed up late watching whatever I felt like, blasted my music as loud as I wanted. It was total freedom. And honestly, I was keeping up with my mom's chore list just to prove her wrong, to show her that, yeah, I could handle things without her watching me 24/7. It felt great. For a while anyway. By day 4, the excitement of having the house to myself was wearing off. The silence was starting to get to me. Without my mom's nagging or my dad's background noise, the quiet felt so heavy. I kept doing the usual chores, dusting, vacuuming, tidying up, but it all felt dull, like I was on autopilot. By day 5, I couldn't deny it. I was actually lonely, and as much as I hated to admit it, I missed having people around, especially my mom. One night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a noise that jolted me wide awake. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but then I heard it again. Soft, shuffling noises coming from somewhere outside my bedroom door. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was. It might have been in the hallway or even downstairs, but one thing was for sure. It was definitely inside the house. It freaked the hell out of me, and I lay there for what felt like forever, completely still, my heart pounding as I listened carefully. Every little noise felt amplified in the silence. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I checked. So I got out of bed, every nerve on edge, and crept toward the door. I just needed to shake this paranoid feeling, to prove to myself that there was nothing there. I turned on the hallway light and leaned over the railing to see downstairs. And that's when I saw a huge man, dressed in all black, standing right in the living room. He was holding our TV, like he was actually planning to carry it out of the house. All the wires were already disconnected, and he had the entire thing balanced in his hands. For a second he froze, caught in the act, and we just stared at each other. I couldn't believe his nerve, to be taking a giant TV while I was home. Then he dropped the TV with a loud thud and bolted toward the stairs, coming right at me. My heart stopped. I bolted back to my room, slammed the door and locked it, my hands shaking so hard I could barely turn the lock. I could hear him coming up the stairs, footsteps heavy and determined. The next thing I knew, he was pounding on my door, rattling the handle, trying to break it down. Panicked, I grabbed my phone and called my mom, barely able to get the words out as I cried, and told her that there's someone in the house. She was just as panicked, but she told me to block the door with whatever I could, and that she'd call the police right away. I pushed my dresser against the door, every second feeling like it could be my last, just hoping he wouldn't get through before help arrived. The banging on my door was relentless, each slam shaking the whole frame. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Desperate, I yelled that I'd called the police and they were on their way, hoping it would scare him off. Then, all of a sudden, the banging just stopped and a deafening silence followed. For a second, I wasn't sure if he'd actually left, or if he was just waiting. The police arrived not long after, their lights flashing outside as I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. They came inside, checked the house, and told me it was probably a random break-in. The guy had managed to steal the TV, which was apparently the most expensive thing in the living room, and broken the front door lock on his way in. My parents showed up close to midnight, completely panicked. They'd been rushing home ever since I called. Seeing them felt like a huge relief, but I was still shaken, replaying everything in my head. The police reassured us, but all I could think about was that man holding the TV in his hands, and the fact that he was willing to come after me while I was alone in the house.